happens with yeah, it's around that time. And for me, it also happened when my book came out. Like just around the time when my book came out, I suddenly couldn't read anymore without glasses. Uh, uh, are we recording? Yes, we are
Yes,
recording.
we're
Right.
recording.
Wonderful. Ah, Samantha, so nice. Thank you for making time to have this conversation. And I'm really excited. Like, I'm excited for you, and I'm excited for everybody who gets to read your new book in the coming months because I haven't read all of it yet, but I have a really strong, from what I've read, a really strong sense that this is going to make a splash and an important splash. It's kind of a reminder of some basics about who we are that is very, very timely. So, welcome and thank you so much for making time.
You're welcome. It's a delight to be here. It's also a delight to hear your introduction. You're one of the most, in my ecosystem, you're one of the most prolific voices of a movement in this world. And I've been really contemplating um, the way in which none of us exist alone and the way we all exist in this fabric of co-emergence, but how certain beings tend, I've been thinking about this as Joanna passed,
Mm.
how Joanna Macy was so an avatar and sort of like a leonine figure in a movement, but also not. Like also very humbly and very clearly a person who knew she was a member of a vast and often nameless community of co-emergence and co-inquiry. And so it's beautiful to hear your introduction to the book. And I just want to name that I feel like it's part of a community of co-emergence and of inquiry that is, has a long tail in history and in beings we've studied with, and also a really diverse tapestry in the present tense.
No, I mean, I remember when we first met in 2009 in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, when Jim Garrison pulled together this climate leadership campaign. And I mean, if you think the elders that were in that meeting as well, like Nancy Roof just passed on, and like a lot of the people that have been holding the ship, so to speak, for humanity, a lot of them are getting older or passing on. And actually, you mentioning Jana reminded me when I was thinking of what can I ask Samantha. I was reminded of something that Joanna did for me many years ago when I was walking in the mountains in Madrid with her, kind of contemplating should I do a PhD or should I not do a PhD? And she said to me, Daniel, I think you should. It will put an important, no, it will put another string on your harp. And just that image of the string on the
Mm.
harp. And so I was wondering, I know a bit about your path, and you've done a really beautiful job at stringing your harp. So, so could you tell us a little bit about how you have strung your harp, the different lineages that have actually brought you to the point that you could then sort of gestate this amazing book?
Sure. Oh, what a lovely image. I was a kid who had a really deep sense that we were in an unprecedented moment of human and planetary history. So I think who I am is fundamentally like, in a way, like an early climate grief, climate dysregulation kid, but I understood that the Cold War was a multipolar trap, and I understood um, I was raised by some early generation environmentalists and queer activists, and there was a sense of like already knowing on top of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring that things were not, the game was rigged, that the game was bigger than the movement. Um, and so I kind of had an early critique of like the and fairly conscious critique of the directions that were offered to me, like lawyer, doctor, um, even entrepreneur. It was like these are not directions that make sense. They're not responsive to the calling of the world, which I did not have a word for, but I felt. And so then I I think the deep threads, I chose at 14 to become really interested in dance and embodiment. Started locking myself in the wrestling room at my high school and like making dances about war and home and the meaning of human existence, and grabbing kids and taking them into holotropic states to generate choreographies about the deepest meaning in our lives. And that became a career as a dancer and choreographer and community developer in San Francisco when there was still a really robust underground art scene, before the dot-com boom. And that synergized with permaculture. It was just like, well, this is the most interesting thing ever. Um, and clearly like an inquiry into the right kind of patterns. And so I started studying permaculture when I was around 24, ended up going to the jungle to study with all the like to do a training with all the rainforest chiefs. And that training was canceled, which became my first shamanic initiation. So if we had embodiment and then permaculture inadvertently led me to like a month-long isolated experience in the jungle where I've really genuinely learned how to commune with parrots and dogs and snakes and the eco fields, as animate, intelligent forces, the water, swimming in the water and drinking it for the first time is like it's an experience I want everyone to have, what it is to finally realize that you can open your mouth and drink as you swim. Um, that's increasingly rare. Um, Swimming in the water at night with the stars reflecting in the water and everything becoming stars and water. Um, and I think those really are the major threads. And then on top of that, I built a global thing, a movement called Dancing Freedom, trained hundreds of facilitators in that, which is dance and movement as a practice of attuning to self and community and nature. And um, and then I was really done with dance. And I think out of that emerged an inquiry into systems and like opportunities to work with Indigenous people and United Nations and multi-stakeholder processes. And so it was like the work of systems emerged out of permaculture community embodiment, which, you know, I live in Silicon Valley, so people think of like systems intelligence or complexity intelligence coming from people who've built computer systems or who've built big businesses, but I came out of, complexity and systems out of studying the body and community and nature and um, and political process. And and I think those are all different and useful directions into an inquiry into systems change and an inquiry into complexity.
You also had a kind of rite of passage ritual teacher, no? Do I remember that
Yes.
correctly? Can't remember the name of the gentleman.
Yes, I've had a few. One was a man named Constantine Darling, who's one of the, unsung great ones, who I met when I was in my late 20s and went quite deep with him, co-facilitated with him, co-led Vision Quest journeys into Australia and Havasupai Canyon. Um, I learned so much from him. I learned so much from him about communion with elementals, including basically inadvertently calling in a flash flood when we were in Havasupai Canyon, which was quite an experience. Amazing experience, harrowing and amazing. And I hadn't thought of that experience in a long time. And then I have had a teacher named George, Gray Eagle Bertelstein, who I studied with very deeply in plant medicine and shamanic work for 5 years, and then moved to Oregon, and he like handed me a bag with all my tools in it and said, "Bless your altar, daughter," and it, like blessed my work as a ceremonial guide. And I'm very hesitant to use the word shamanic. I use it increasingly. I do use it with increasing frequency because it's the only word that points to a whole quadrant of um, way of being, way of working, way of understanding psyche and soma and animacy that we don't have a better word for in English
Mhm.
yet. I'd like us to have a better word that was more respectful of the lineages that it's, I think of it as neo-shamanic or neo-indigenous, and um, neo-indigenous is distinct from like, neo-shamanic is a subset of a neo-indigenous way of being. Um, which we could would be a good neo-indigenous refers to an emergent pattern of uh, human individuals and communities and processes writ large, civilizational scale that realign with place. So it's in a term that I've coined in concert with bioregionalism to explore the identity development of people who recognize that our belonging to place is fundamental to our humanness. Similarly, neo-shamanic points to that same kind of like the leaving that is modernity, the separability that is modernity, then restitching itself into a fabric of uh, praxis. I
It,
think the word is
it's interesting because if I think of it more as a returning to or reformulating a 21st century animism that
absolutely.
that brings us back into right relationship with life. That is, and that's for everyone. But
Hmm.
the shamanic practice was also not always for everyone in the past. So the first layer is the animistic layer of how do we um, re-relate to ourselves, our living body, life itself as a planetary process, in a way that the boundary between category alive, category dead simply becomes somewhat nonsensical. And then within that, I'm just sort of reflecting on whether neo-shamanic and neo-indigenous, it just for me, like, and I think I know that your work expresses the same thought, like rediscovering our own indigeneity in life itself, out of life,
Absolutely.
out of life.
Yes.
Is what it's all about. And somehow I have this sense that any kind of labeling of indigenous versus non-indigenous, shamanic versus non-shamanic kind of thing, it gets us back into territories where it's even harder mentally to actually re-enter that relational reality where everything is alive, everything is meaningful, everything is intelligent, and everything is.
Yeah. I think the care there's care there not to co-opt or invisibilize the depth of both knowledge and trauma that has been inflicted on living Indigenous people
Mhm.
who are in the continuity of being Indigenous. There's respectfulness and care to not inflict further harm by absorbing identity that
Mhm.
isn't correctly um, understood. I think so. But I would say holding any of the terms lightly is absolutely critical because like the cut, becomes a cut of complexity that's unnecessary because the gesture, the action is one that is actually foundationally transverbal. It's both nonverbal and wider than verbal and greater than verbal, like who I became by virtue of the experiences I had in Brazil. was not like, oh, well, now I know I'm indigenous. Um, but I became it was there was an initiation that occurred in that month of like becoming really permanently permeable
Mhm.
to the more than human world in a way that I already was very permeable. I was a kid who spent tons of time in nature. Like the only time I lied to my parents was to get out into nature by myself all the time. Um, and so that was not difficult for me or but there was a distinct departure of a construct of self that had a bounded kind of westernness to it from to a different construct of self that didn't.
Mhm.
um yeah, and I think we need to give that permission. I think that the linguistic cuts very quickly cut off inquiry.
Mhm. Yeah, no, for me, it's a very alive inquiry at the moment to find, I guess, my work's sort of converging more with the work of the Anines Foundation. And through that, I'm kind of reminded of Annes's invitation to, a bit like what I did in my book, like on at the entrance of his hut, Tvergastein, up on the mountain that he built in the 1930s. It says something along the lines that we desperately need to ask deeper questions. Um,
Mhm.
and um, and for me, his life and also the kind of tradition in which the foundation is developing is basically what is this inquiry in the Western modern world, in the like basically we need to celebrate the diversity of worldviews, but we also need to find as European Western people a formulation of the synthesis between kind of original participation and the age of separation in coming into final participation. And
Mhm.
um, and for me, that I guess because when we're in Europe, it's less so like there's a sort of bath reflex that I've got at the moment with the fetishization of indigeneity.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
it's disrespectful of indigenous people the way that's going on all around
Yeah.
the globe. And and so I think we need to find a way of talking about these things and from a Western tradition, also recovering the Western roots of indigeneity, which aren't that far away. Like all of this modernity madness is it's only a couple of thousand years old, really.
Right.
And
Well, and it's really as it is about building relationships
mm,
that engage the imagination, that engage the body, that engage um all the different ways of knowing that a village would know, right? Like an old person is going to know the history of the tree and the ways that, and a child is going to know the tree as a place to climb in and imagine castles in. And all of that goes into the fabric of a culture that is more attuned to place. I think I also think, I was talking with someone yesterday. I had a conversation yesterday about deep time and time education. And there's a dimension where, we live in a world that's so kind of hyper obsessed with the time doesn't exist kind of physics narrative, but you don't get back into place-based relations that are um, in any way vital without a sense of the deep time of the place that includes the future of the place.
I, I increasingly in the last months, actually, it's kind of come even clearer for me to see how rootless, how crippled, how brutalized or brutally decontextualized we actually all are in this globalized world. This relationship to place that you named a couple of times is so fundamental to what it means to be human. It's all about like the right, being in right relationship is being in right relationship with the intimate lived context of an analog world of real sensory contact with. And that is layered in story because as human beings we live in story. And so how story and place in those people who are really place-based cultures, like who have 65, 105,000 years, I think is the last recent data from some parts of Australia, 105,000 years of unbroken connection to place, of people carrying the law of the land, the story of the land from generation to generation. We have no idea what it means to be embedded in that way and how fundamentally meaningful everything is and how you couldn't but respect all other manifestations of life. And yeah, this how do we connect people back to place in such a profound way?
This is a huge question. And I think one where there's like so much space for inquiry and experiment and innovation and um, there's fun. I mean, we have a bioregional explorers club
Hmm.
here in the Bay Area that I've had mixed feelings about because it's very not a doing. It's like, oh, so I'm going to spend the whole day and I'm going to hike out to this and go harvest this and do this thing. And how else would we get to know? It's like it's a really good experiment, particularly because it involves feeding ourselves and getting to know the phosphorescent phytoplankton and like these really amazing things that you have to effort to get to know. Um, and I mean, I think that inquiry also has specificity in terms of the place. It's like last year I started doing a winter solstice ceremony. I live in a county that has a mountain in the middle of it. I live in Marin County, and Marin County is defined by Mount Tamalpais, which is a standalone mountain. It's a super cool mountain. It's profoundly biodiverse because it has the ocean on one side and the bay on the other side. When you really actually think about it, you're like, wow, this is really idyllic. It's an amazing place. So we do a solstice ceremony from the top of the mountain, and everyone makes prayers to like kind of the approximate from the top, the approximate watershed that they live in.
Hmm. Nice.
Um, and so that's and last year it was beautiful. Like people showed up. I invited from multiple different communities, and this year I'm going to put the invite out soon. And I'm hoping to generate a thing, and I'm going to go to the county board of supervisors and actually chat with them about it because I think that it could become a civic process
Hmm.
that is countywide and that has, imagine what that looks like when there is actually a music venue up at the top of the mountain. Like there could be a thing that occurs that also involves some kind of a community council about caring for our watersheds.
Hmm.
Where like I was just in Austin, and at the center of Austin is Barton Springs, and everyone goes to Barton Springs. So there's an inquiry into what features are distinctive in a place that actually can deepen a sense of identity for a place, whether that's like prairie land restoration in Middle America, whether that's, I mean, the Tramontana in Majorca, whether that's, um, yeah, it's distinct to place. And I mean, there's interesting things going on with food, but food gets very siloed because you can only have so many people at a table. So it's interesting to ask these questions and
But there's
continue to ideate on them.
I place also has another thing that is becoming clear to me is that place is quite literally the higher ground we can reach for to heal the polarization that we've been willfully
Yes.
submitted to. Like
I have been thinking about that so much. It's the oblique
only it's the only
reality.
place where you can have somebody who's quite left-wing in their attitude and somebody who's quite right-wing in their attitude spend 5 hours waxing lyrical about their love for place, the uniqueness of the valleys, the fauna, the flora, the rivers, and how they need to be taken care of, and completely forget about political opinion and find themselves as sh- people who love that place and its community, and then kind of go, oh yeah, we don't need to agree on everything. Yeah. And 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 I've seen it and like how powerful any kind of reactivating a shared commitment to the custody and stewardship of place sorry um, is something that can actually really heal the biggest divide that we're currently finding almost everywhere on the planet.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I've been thinking about this too, of there's a friend of mine is working on a West Coast project with the salmon
Mhm.
and watershed management and the farmers. And the farmers are taking a lead from the indigenous understanding of what is necessary for the salmon runs to support the watersheds so that the farmers have water. And that it's like it's a multi-state process that's including some really hard decisions about basically sacrificing the more southern salmon runs because of climate change,
Mhm.
of like agreements of how hot far down are we going to go. One of the ways that one would talk about Cascadia around that massive bioregion up the west coast of the United States is as Cascadia, and it's called Salmon Nation
Mhm.
is one of you probably know all this, but I'm saying this for viewers, and it's like one of the aspects of place-based consciousness like this, where there's this oblique shared identity, is those identities are very poetic, and they're poetic in a way that's non-arbitrary. It's like to identify as Salmon Nation and then invite a bunch of really conservative farmers and ranchers to collaborate with the indigenous to like develop care for the salmon runs and also collectively make hard choices about how to manage this in the context of climate change. There's so much beauty in that. There's so much moral and ecological and mythical beauty in that.
I keep thinking of my friend and living legend Andy Lipkiss from Tree People in LA. I don't think
Mm.
he would agree with sacrificing the southern salmon runs. He has spent his entire life bringing with the vision of bringing the salmon back into the LA River, and I think sometimes these visions audacious enough to defy the limited perspective of our currently conventional scientific reductionist consensus about what's still possible is also good. We have created so much damage that we need to hold a vision of healing that borders on the miraculous, um, even if it's only to achieve the halfway point. Uh,
Mhm.
so But yeah, it's interesting. I was earlier when we were talking, you were telling a story that I would love you to come back to. But as you were telling it, I was reminded of a recent conversation with Martin Lee Müller, who wrote that book, Being Salmon, beautiful book, and he did his PhD research on the salmon runs and the salmon industry in the Pacific Northwest and also in Norway, where he's based. And he told me this story of meeting an indigenous elder somewhere in British Columbia, in a place where actually a positive move. They had begun to dismantle the first big dams that had been put in pretty much exactly 100 years earlier. Um,
Mhm.
and he talked to an elder of a tribe that had unbroken oral first-hand witness reports of how when that dam was built, the entire bay was red when the salmon returned because the salmons would jump against the wall until they died. What an image, huh? But 100 years of keeping that memory alive, um, and what kind of culture that assures in terms of bringing back that point where the dam does actually get dismantled. For me, that it's a beautiful, beautiful little story. And when you shared something about an indigenous elder that you also write about in your book that also works with kind of disaster preparedness and avoiding
Yeah.
existential risk. And when yeah, maybe
I'll share. I want to respond to that story you just shared with one more stitch, which is that in the Winneman Wintu cosmology, the Winneman Wintu are in the kind of Shasta area of Northern California and Southern Oregon. The salmon are the most intelligent being in all of creation. So I think one of the reasons why we kind of like lionize or fetishize indigenous people and indigenous wisdom is because often there's pattern tracking embedded in that, those ways of knowing and those ways of understanding the nature of reality, the nature of nature, that so deeply bend the Western mind in such extraordinarily helpful ways that it's easy to put it on a pedestal and like um putting the pedestal aside, like the insight that the salmon are the most intelligent organism in all of creation as a way of thinking about what intelligence is, that the salmon are these beings who can swim, can inhabit freshwater and saltwater, can remember where their home is, can transfer all the nutrients from the sea to the entire forest and ecofield to support all of the rest of the life with a kind of abundance that would be entirely impossible if they did not carry the memory of how to return home from their birthing grounds. Like the mapping of that as what intelligence is and can be in service to, as opposed to, can it refine the silicon to, an umpteenth micron of size to do this piece of work, as the reductionist abstraction, decontextualized kind of direction that we've taken intelligence to, like the hyper contextualization that the salmon are like the avatar of the hyper contextualized intelligence that serves everything. um is I love that story. I've told that story a lot because I think it breaks through a current like the way we have currently constructed the idea of what intelligence is, the concept of intelligence.
I mean, I started my academic life as a marine mammal biologist, fascinated by marine mammal communication and cognition, and of course, these animals have larger brains with more synaptic connections than we do. And it's interesting that it's true, like the salmon is the largest nutrient transfer on Earth from the sea to the land through the salmon runs in the past. Um, the other one of the largest nutrients transfers is what the whales used to do from the deep ocean to the upper ocean, regulating global climate that way. Because without the whale poop, the stuff from down in the ocean doesn't come back up, and that used to have a massive effect. Like basically we started to drive climate change even before we started using fossil fuels by killing the
Uh,
whales for the whale oil. Um, and and that's another, yeah, it's interesting that I just made that connection with the sort of intelligence of the salmon and well, I mean, this is a mythological intelligence, but on the other hand, exactly putting putting in question where intelligence actually lives, because the entire notion that it's somewhere between our ears in an organ called the brain is somewhat limiting.
Agreed.
But yeah, you wanted to tell the story of this man in Colombia.
Yes. So in 2017, I went to an event in the heart of the mission in San Francisco that was called Kairos. And at this event, there was a man speaking, a man named Chief Antonio Chavez, who's this lovely, lovely um, man from the Lenca people. The Lenca people are a people who currently live in Nicaragua, Honduras, and um, he got up on stage and he shared their oral history. That's a 10,000 year history of remembering when climate change happened and when the ice age came, and they realized that it was getting too cold to live in central North America. So they were like in the plains, kind of in I think they were more in the Mississippi Delta area. And they realized it was getting really cold. And they packed up their seeds and they packed up their stories and they packed up their elders. And some people went overland down to the Gulf and got in canoes and went across the ocean. And some people went down the land bridge down Latin America, and they ended up making a life in what is now Central America. And they had carried, all of that wisdom with them. And then they continued to tell their stories. And then the stories remember when the slave traders came and the conquistadors came and when their people were enslaved. And they remember when the country was founded and they were erased from legal memory, from legal rights. And they've slowly regained their political rights as a people. So he told all this whole story and through the lens of a living oral lineage. And he said, if you're in this room, your people have been through as the same or worse. And the only difference between us is that my people remember. And because we remember, we recognize that it is the carrying of those stories and seeds that actually creates the context with which you can respond to what's occurring in the world effectively and continue to nurture culture forward. And so I invite you to get very clear about what stories and seeds and protocols and practices you're carrying, because you never know what's coming. And it is likely that a dark age is coming. He's also someone who's worked very deeply with, not with Carol Sanford, with the woman who wrote recently, Care for the Human Spirit. Um, anyway, he's done a lot of work around resilience and what it is to be responsive in the context of collapse. And he works in the corporate space. And he said, that's what you need to get clear about right now. You need to get clear about what stories and seeds and protocols, practices you're carrying
Isn't,
that
sorry, so it could continue, but I just have
that can carry us through whatever's coming.
the it just feels somewhat tragic to think that we're meeting this time of complete and utter um, reorientation after decades of ever more degenerate education systems and a current hype of AI and the capacity to simply have all knowledge at your fingertip or even just asking with voice recognition. The assumption that all of humanity will, in perpetuity, have access to this knowledge, plus the assumption that this knowledge is actually entirely reliable, the way it's currently being curated for us, is just two fundamentally mistaken assumptions. And
Agreed.
in the context of what this gentleman was trying to remind us of, it's almost saying like, for Christ's sake, our bundles are empty. We don't even know how to recognize the plants, nor do we know when the birds are migrating, nor how to tend the soil in a kind of large scale of the population. The majority of people have zero clue of any of that. And yeah, and even how safe are our backup systems of the core information we store about given territories? Because in the move towards digitalization's rationalization of saving space, um, non-digital archives have just been shredded. Um, so yeah.
It's gonna get weird. I mean, in the more anti-fragile versions of how we get through this, the digital is a great ally to getting through this. Could be, can be a great ally. You know, if we end up on the more anti-fragile, more kind of techno-optimistic pathways through this, there's the potential that technology could become an ally to us relearning our trees and our birds and our soils and our um, pathways and patterns through relationship with other humans and with space and with time and um, those potentials exist.
Possibly
Uh,
as an intermediary, I could imagine, like basically as a stepping stone, I could imagine that we might have
mhm.
still enough of a window that people could, as they re-see the value of learning local knowledge, do so mediated by technology.
Yeah.
Um, but I would hope
And I think for anyone with like the proclivity to be listening to this podcast, to
that
be listening to this conversation, I mean, I have my collapsed book collection, which is I'm growing quick. You know, I buy used books and I see myself as a library keeper. And I think that's a really helpful and important thing to do while we still have a supply chain that is moving these books around to collect them and curate them and care for them. And I think it's um one thing I'm circumspect about as I'm finishing, as this book is coming into the world, like there's many domains that I could play in, and I'm seeing this real need for kind of more everyday people to be able to sense make their way through this and talk about what's going on and have space for that. But there's also a need for a revivification of permaculture education and of watershed education and of gardening education. And I am sitting with like, what's, how can I collaborate with bigger movements around that? Like, not like this is mine to do, but it's not mine to do. And how can I do that in the context of a bigger movement that is organized around grounding in our bodies and grounding in food resilience and
if you want to offer an introductory course on your book through Gaia Education, just let me know. We can do that easily.
Fantastic. I'd
Mhm.
love to.
Because that's for me, my work with Guy Education over the last 20 years is trying to do that, is trying to
Uh-huh.
support those people on the ground who want to learn about these things, both online and offline, to
Yeah.
learn basic facilitation skills, basic local economy skills, basic understanding the kind of structural and systemic critique of what is, and that there are alternative worldviews and alternative ways of interpreting the current mess. And basically that's, yeah, that's what the both the EDE and the GETS online course are, to my mind, they're kind of, if we had a decent education system, they wouldn't be necessary because it's kind of a 101 course of how to be
Right.
sensible, connected citizens, and with some basic systemic literacy of how are we embedded and obliged.
Right.
But since we don't have that in school, I keep thinking that now that Guy Education is 20 years old, rather than kind of think, oh, maybe there needs to be a new organization that kind of does something similar and does this in the modern age, to actually jump to, instead of reaching whatever what they've reached, maybe a 50,000, 100,000 people, how would we reach hundreds of millions with this?
I love that design question. I'm on board with that design question because why rebuild that? Why redo that wheel? And that is the correct brand. You
Yeah,
know, it's like, we actually do need Gaia education.
okay, exactly.
It turns out.
And
I
it
mean,
has
I
this,
think we're in a moment. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
yeah, just briefly to spin off on that, like the first curriculum was put together over 7 years with people, practitioners from eco-villages around the world, global north and global south, meeting both in the global north and the global south, teaching each other ways of learning together. And out of that, the
Mm.
curriculum wheel and the core work came. And then the more academic version and online version needed a lot more backbone, and a lot of that came from my PhD and other things. But
Yeah,
the sacred process of bringing together learners from global north and south as a learning community to have an inquiry of what is the curriculum we need to have to support community, that like kind of origin stories matter. And this is, and we're talking 1997 to 2005. This is long before everybody was kind of becoming aware that we needed more
right.
South learning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, it'd be lovely to have you. Like Lila June is currently doing a course with Guy Education, and that's been very
She's
successful. There's over
fantastic.
200 people on it, and yeah, I'm one way of bringing more people to that kind of already existing work is by having the next generation, the people who are now doing stuff, do kind of
Right.
introductory courses with them, and then you can always have your long kind of year-long learning journey that you offer, and you see that just as an on-road where you offer six webinars or something about your book. Anyway, just planting a seed.
I love that we're ideating right here.
Yeah, why not?
Morning. It's so good. That fucking lootly. Can I say that on
Yeah,
here?
absolutely. Because I don't get, there's no editing. So you can say whatever you want, but it won't get
Great.
edited out.
Well, I mean, to piggyback on what you said, something I've been thinking about lately, this is an example of something I've been thinking about lately where it's like so much of what we need is already here, and it only needs a little tweaking and kind of like rebranding and anchoring into emerging networks
Mm.
to potentially scale at a different level than it has. It's like most of what, and I've been struggling with this in terms of my theory of change, where I'm about to, like, the invite you just offered me is exactly my prayer because it doesn't make sense for me to try to like recreate a whole other thing or like
Don't go
it,
build the book.
and it also doesn't make sense in a broken epistemic ecology to try to like build a movement because you can't. But what you can do is like work with the oblique shared care of the land and some very non-arbitrary things like we are all part of this earth. Like that's why Gaia education is like, yes, exactly. Like we are in a moment where I think there's a potential to gather those stories and seeds that have already been tended. You know, you've already been tending this for 20 years in an emergent context that's the increasing pressure of unwinding systems.
And I mean, the question that you sort of put in the room with what do you carry in your bundle? That's a good question for a course, and a kind of good collective reflection of what would be your core skills that you kind of better make sure you get some kind of muscle memory of,
Mhm.
and not just script sheets because they might just get lost in the big
Right,
move. So
right.
it's all basically if it's not in the muscle memory in here, it might be gone. And
Right.
um, and that's why part of where I'm at the moment. Like, I had a bit of a wobbly after the pandemic and with moving house and my daughter starting school, where she went into a bit of a depression for a while and everything was extremely dark.
Mm.
And in that darkness, the the profundity of counsel, of the circle way, of being able to hold that ritual in a way that it actually gives people an embodied experience of collective intelligence, an embodied experience of approximating knowing without coming to a final decision, but by hearing diverse voices circle around the question rather than try to find a definitive answer for. All those things are that for me that is the one thing that when I ask myself in those dark moments, what actually makes sense? What can you still teach people when the possibility of having all terra firma pulled away from under your feet is not only real but possibly imminent?
Mhm.
And it's whatever increases the relational tissue at the community regional scale between people and between people and the land that they depend on is
Mhm.
basically what we can now still do. Um, and
Yeah.
teaching people skills like counsel, and because counsel is also like it's so multifunctional. It's almost like when you think about it, the beginning of humanity is with us sitting in circle around the fire and with us spitting some paint against our hand against the cave wall. So somewhere between art and counsel, we stopped being apes and we started being humans. But yeah, so how would we help people to fill their bundles in the next 5 to 10 years in
Yes.
meaningful ways?
Yes. And meaningful, beautiful, and practical. That's a very lovely triangle. Um, because I think the beauty is often forgotten. And I mean, we live in both a very highly abstracted, decontextualized culture, but we also live in a highly instrumentalized culture, which is also a dumbing down of our humanity, you know. And um, and I think without that care for beauty, we're lost already.
This is interesting, the practical bit. Reminds me of a story that Gigi Coyle quite often tells when she teaches people about the way of counsel, when she was part of a group of people that worked with a big land care decision around the wind park, I think that involved indigenous land ownership and some companies and so on. And so they were basically in a council where indigenous people and and engineers from from the energy company, and um, and the kind of disconnect of sitting in council about something for a couple of hours and all indigenous elders having a complete clarity after getting up from the council of what was decided or what was talked, what was clarified. And the engineer is kind of going, where's the outcome paper? Like what is the decision? Yeah. And came up when you just said practical, because the word practical is a real trap, because it in our Western culture is like that insult against anybody who's theoretical or just talking. Eh? But it's exactly that if we don't understand how the just talking and the theory, the worldview, the narrative, the story we're embedded in is actually informing all practice all the time. And so
Right.
there is no such thing as being impractical while shifting the narrative. That is the most practical thing you can do.
Mhm.
But our culture doesn't see it that way.
No, I mean, our culture wants deliverables and bullet points. I mean, it's one way to think about it is in the Ian McGilchrist frame of it's a more left, our culture is very left-brained about what constitutes pragmatism or practicality, and more traditional cultures are more whole-brained and more primarily right-brained around it. It's like we feel, we sense, we have an aesthetic, we have a noetic sense of what just occurred that's unified and has directionality, and um that can be unifying in a right brain way of being, in a way that actually lands as uncomplicated and complex at the same time. I mean, and that's the amazing thing about that more holistic, more whole-brained way of knowing, is you can have complexity and extra and clarity at the same time.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a very different kind of clarity, and it's interesting because when you do real kind of system sensing, you do get into a embodied knowing about the system that is very strong, but you can't necessarily argue it to to
right.
somebody. Like I'm just noticing a lot um, the way I operate
Yeah.
different fields that I work in. Like whether it's here at the bioregional local scale in Mallorca or with certain projects, there are moments where propositions are being made or fractions of the collaboration group gallop off into the sunset with one idea, and I just sit there and I know this is going to tap energy out of the process, and this is just a complete diversion, and it's not going to work. Uh, but you can't really say it in that way, in that moment. You can't just say, yeah.
You navigate that a lot. I mean, I having had the opportunity to work with you a little bit on the water work in Mallorca.
Mm,
It was amazing watching you collaborating with you in the way that you have knowing that is so tuned and textured and um meta relational, to
mhm.
use Vanessa Andreotti's frame on it. It's meta relational, and it already has deep time embedded in it in terms of the the relationships you tended, the the discursive context of a possibility for the land, of a possibility for the watershed. I mean, perhaps that's one of your horizons, is how to bring that with increasing vitality as an elder in the becoming.
It's a tricky one because it's also like seeing because now that the bioregional movement is gaining strength, and of course, you get the younger generation who wants to make a mark, which is wonderful, and wants to be involved in the wonderful. But because of our fast invent yourself by creating a website and changing your profile on LinkedIn culture. Um, People just want to be bioregional weavers because it's fashionable right now. There's, I mean, you wrote that in your book that somewhere in the footnote you mentioned modestly that you've done 40,000 hours of embodied practice. And it's those kind of things that by the time you get to sort of our point in the life story, you just that has formed who you are in the most profound way that will inform and transform in effect every single intervention that you do in the rest of your life. Um, because the state of being of the intervener affects the quality of the intervention. And how do we, in this spirit we were just talking about, how do we help people fill their bundles, fill also in this you would call it maybe indigenous tradition, how do we remind people of that certain practices need time and they need humility and they need repetition and they need embeddedness and accepting elders for a while, accepting teachers for a while. You cannot jump to, oh yeah, that sounds like a cool job description. I'm going to be a bioregional weaver now and show up with people who you have no idea who they are and tell them how to do things because you think that that's how it should be. It's kind of when you've humbly listen for 15 years of what's going on here, then and build relationships and build little like projects that might have succeeded or failed, but because of that, build a relationship that is based on we've gone through success and failure together, so we can call on each other. And out of that, you can then make 5 phone calls and bring a group of people together, and suddenly a regenerative forestry hub for the Balearics is in conversation. But you can't just say, I'm a bioregional weaver and call 5 people and say, come together. They won't come. And so how do we bring those deeper apprenticeships into the world again?
Mhm. Yeah, I've been thinking, I have no idea, but well, I do have some ideas. I think if one asks of some thoughtful theory of change questions around bioregionalism, that there is a thing that needs to be created that supports apprenticeships. Like if we start to develop a really rigorous theory of change around bioregionalism, which you've certainly done more work to do than most people, one pillar of that needs to be creating journey schools or something that is not the permaculture design certificate,
Mm.
that is a supported context to apprentice to certain to a person or to an organization or to, yeah, I think that there's that, I mean, and perhaps that's a thing that Gaia Education could be supportive of, is a independent study track that's an apprenticeship track.
I know that people have been working on that for a while, not in Gaia Education, but Andy Langford from the UK Permaculture Association um,
Mhm.
and uh, no, Andy Goldring from the UK Permaculture and Andy Langford from Gaia University. Um,
Mhm.
they have, I think the working title is something called Accreditor or something. Like basically, the idea is to sort of have a kind of passport that people could do online courses, residential courses, internships all around the world in the wider eco-village, Gaia education, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, you name it, process-oriented psychology, dragon dreaming, facilitation, all of those things. But rather than having a portfolio of did this course, did that course, did that course, each one of those courses becomes credits in a kind of umbrella system that then as the umbrella system with the kind of logo of all the people that are part of this says, well, you've done the equivalent of a master's or of an undergraduate degree, and so create a more of a career pathway that people could take traveling around the world, learning in different bioregions, and basically stringing their harp to come back to that image, and then have an organization that basically certifies the harp collectively.
Yes.
I think that sort of thing we're hopefully moving towards. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, in terms of your vision for your book, how because you work in so many different fields, and with some of your work being quite supporting to individuals or organizations or projects that aren't necessarily public. They might have public
Yeah.
influence, but how do you see your book reaching the people and finding translation into the different sub-communities that are out there that all would really benefit from your book?
Hmm.
There's this active work that I can tell you from my my experience. The hard work starts when the thing is out. You think, oh,
Exactly.
it's done. It's like you're barely at the halfway point. Uh,
I think I'm actually pretty aware of that and both excited and trepidatious about it. Um, I think there's so many ways that the book, as you said, each chapter is like a different, there's 14 chapters. Each chapter is a different direction in the book has application in the psychedelic space. It has application in the systems design space. It has application in leadership development space. In a way, like professionally, the two primary kind of hats that the three primary hats that I wear currently are like executive coach, executive mentor, helping people very much in the space of personal transformation, and then applying that in their work in the world. And then that bridges to like the consultant hat that also develops content, curriculum, facilitates offsites, helps people convene in a way that moves mission forward. And then there's ceremonial guide, which is much more embodied and multidimensional and animistic and all of the things that that implies. And I anticipate bit more of the speaker hat coming out of this book writing, which is a hugely vulnerable, like standing on a stage and speaking is one of the most vulnerable things that I know of in my world. But I do see being a useful voice around cultural vision that can take us through this time in human history in a way that is good. And I think that I have something to contribute there that is built on the backs of so many brilliant, amazing wisdom teachers. I just happen to be as in this generational moment, someone who can talk about it.
Mm.
Um, I see, yeah, there's the balance, as you know, coming out of writing a book between where do you like position yourself and then who comes to you because they're like, this is really useful to me and I'd like to be in relationship with this. I think bioregionalism is definitely one of the areas where I'm interested in collaborating very deeply. Um, the
You know,
transformation of the material supply chain is another place where I'm really interested in working because I already work in the packaging industry. And what I'm seeing things that are very unprecedented in terms of large um, communities of brands and businesses wanting to shift how they do things and wanting to find their way to adopt emergent practices and emergent pathways for doing the forward of provisioning the world in a way that is better for the world. And I think there's like best case scenarios where it's not stick driven, but it's more vision driven. It's not just and it's not carrot driven, where like transformation is ethically driven by our love for life and the basic realization that we're part of a Gaian process, and that tending, engaging it custodially is much more meaningful and beautiful and morally coherent and valuable than, extracting from it. So I see doing work in the business sector. Um, and I see doing work around like this bundle. Like, what is the bundle? And how do I get to how can I be a better educator and support to people's self-development and relational development in that way? Um, I
I,
also get really curious about how True Human might apply in the tech sector to one of the aspects of True Human is an inquiry into what actually constitutes a technologically mature civilization. And I think that's a critical conversation. I think the people who are defining technological maturity are not defining it in a mature way. They're defining and
immature
that
people define technological maturity. You've
yes.
basically got the worst nightmare. It's like Atari playing geeks ruling the world. Uh,
Yeah. Asperger's body minds who
but
don't
since
have a deep sense of relationality.
you brought up the terms so many times now that I do have to share with you. You know that I have a bit of a I Satish Kumar once said to me, every ism creates a schism.
Um,
And there's a sub fraction of the mushrooming global bioregining movement that is actively using bioregionalism almost a bit like a political rallying cry and the othering and them against us and this is it and that's the old system, it's broken and this is the new system and and it exactly the same subsection is then also selling it as the panacea for everything, collapsing a conversation around how to do this whole planetary story into only a regional story. And so for me, that I would distinguish between like because the bioregionalism energy is the one that has also led to in Germany that search word being flagged by the security agencies as putting you into the right spectrum of the political arena. Um, and in the UK, it's becoming to be considered anti-national. Um, and so I feel like in our work of finding the higher ground and the unifying processes, what we're working with is bioregioning, which I would call humanity's long-term evolutionary survival pattern that we've kind of lost but are slowly returning to. And
Mhm.
it's interestingly linked to the other thing you mentioned, which is the sort of circular provisioning and at what scale, because the two are very much linked in the sense that if we don't dare to become pretty radical localists and regionalists, we will never find out what innovation can make us meet human needs 80, 90% in the region for the region, because we'll say, no, that's not possible, that's no economics of scale, da, da, da. But if we close off completely against any form of globally traded technologies and support and infrastructure, then we probably won't be able to build the technological platforms that would actually allow us to radically re-regionalize 80 or 90% of core needs of production.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the fluidity of the map has to be global. It has to have subsidiarity. It has to have best case scenario all involves fluid boundaries. Um, I agree with you. It's also poignant to hear you. I was not aware of Germany or the UK and that.
Mm.
uh, the degree to which that is the isming has occurred, right? Um, my friend Nicole Nigawetti, who is it mirrors her process. She's working in the food system and just published a book on food system resilience that's brilliant. And she pretty much left the bioregining movement because of those schisms that she was tracking.
Mm.
But yeah, like I feel there's a need for stories that tell the vital tale of the flows at multiple orders of scale,
Mm.
right? Like one of the way that I talk about place in my book is of holons of scale that are fluid and flexible. And I think there's also a poetry. I've been thinking about the poetry of the planetary boundaries science as a poetry, as a story language
Well, I mean,
for,
the Panaki is what inspired the whole kind of scale linking work that I did in my PhD, well, 20 years ago,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
of, of how basically these small and fast and large and slow adaptive cycles at different scales across the system, from local, regional, biome to biosphere, um, have to be seen as all one interconnected system. Any systematization of it is our mental categorization of a fluid process. And so
yes,
how do we actually keep asking the question of how to link across these scales, but also learn from how in nature certain like information flows faster than materials, and further. So the same with as people move towards a more biomaterials based supply chain of fiber, food, energy, and so on. I experimented with some of that with a detergent company from Belgium, here on Mallorca for a while. And the one thing that came out of our 2 year pilot study was if you try to build a bioregional regenerative biomaterials economy, you better work with policy about how cascading of the resources is insisted upon by the legislator. Meaning, you cannot take the biomass and press it into pellets or chip it into wood chip and burn it if that biomass has more important uses higher up in the energy cascade. Because you by biomass to
mm,
burning, you're not making chemicals out of biogas, you're not making biochar and soil amendments and new materials. So it's how
mm,
do we actually create these ecosystems that have the trophic levels to get the
mm,
most out of the resources? That's going to be a real like I'm currently beginning to make this conversation a bit more real here on Mallorca again with the forestry sector and minefield, minefield.
right.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah. That's interesting. My friend Rory Tews has a very interesting proposal to put maker spaces at the center of that process. I'd love to share that with you offline because
Mhm.
it creates a flywheel around localized economy that's distinct from the natural resources.
That would be interesting too. Yeah, because we're basically working on something really interesting at the moment here on Mallorca that could go into the
Mhm.
basically it's partially reinventing the land care practices in the Tramontana to give value to the biomass that is currently turning the entire forest into a tinderbox and that could be
Right.
burned out any day.
And
And
restart the portable biochar
that
history.
Yeah, well, it was yeah portable on donkey back in the past, and now we need to bring it into the 21st century,
Yes.
and that's kind of partially already happening with new equipment already being on the island that would allow that, and but it's so much has been broken, like we don't have the sawmills anymore and so on, so that it's like building an entire value chain for the forestry sector again. But all of this is basically the work that we need to do in every place around the planet. And it actually creates jobs, it creates more diverse opportunities for learning and education. It creates
Yes.
opportunity of bringing people together. So yeah, um, plenty of work to do.
Lots of work to do, no shortage.
But have
Yes.
you, because you also sometimes work with sort of somewhat in the field of advising philanthropists, and bringing that kind of community into the insights that you explore and through human in a kind of more through a sort of workshop type space. Have you thought about that, or maybe looked at?
For sure. And there's some invitation to do that work, which is exciting. It's hard work. And there's a need, there's a real need for a back and forth dialogue with where there are piloted solutions.
Mhm.
Because one of the chicken and egg challenges is like once you've re-educated elites, what do they do? And I mean, that chicken and egg problem exists everywhere in society. And it's not fair to put it on, kind of put it on anyone to need to figure it out.
Mhm.
So, there's interesting opportunities with like a synergy between, for example, the apprenticeship project that we just talked about as a piece of a theory of change, where the more we scaffold an ecology where there is a sense for a flexible map of a theory of change that involves particular processes that are starting to scale, like Gaia education, like this potential um, context for supporting people to get certified for their bundles of resilience
Mhm.
through apprenticeship that we've just ideated, like developing a small scale industry hub at the center of communities as a center for um, making whatever is needed in the community and reconfiguring how we use energy and materials in flows within the economy. Like you start to scaffold that together, and then that becomes a very powerful ecology to bring people into through that kind of education and initiation. Um, and those things need to dance together because otherwise there's no there. And folks with money tend to be very pragmatic people. And it's important to honor that aspect of their genius
Mhm.
in the process. Um, so I like that you brought that up. It is definitely a thread I'm thinking about, and there's some opportunity there. And it can best be supported, work with with families and foundations, and also with wealth holders generally, can be best supported when there's a robust kind of e ecosystem of emergent projects and a theory of change attached to them that makes sense, that has integrated what has failed well. And I need a lot of help to do that. That's a thing I'd like to do in an ecology, in a community of um it's not work that can be done by one person. It's work that needs to be done.
Being bombarded with people. Um,
Right?
yeah,
Oh, after having said that.
exactly. No,
Great.
the, the for me, the danger with all these stories that people still want a pathway to scale. Um,
Right. It's
And
true.
even getting too obsessed about theory of change, um, which is also something that people really like to be have clearly expressed. What's your theory of change and all that? It, it brings a bit of that kind of the Tao, that's the true Tao, cannot be expressed in words, and the real change is what happens. That's life, and the theory is a tangential to that process that will or will not happen, will happen anyway. It's a bit like somewhere in your book, you just sort of casually state that life will win and we'll figure it out. Like it's not about that. Like that always continues. And it's a similar way change and transformation, it always continues. So for me, the most exciting philanthropic experiments that are beginning to happen is when philanthropists identify people with deep regional groundedness and trust in the system and equip them to
Yes.
energize what's already in a territory through very uncomplicated flow funding. Um,
Right.
so,
Right.
so literally being able to deploy $5,000 there and sometimes $500 there, so this little thing can get printed for this little community. Um, And in but you need to have the ear on the ground and be aware of these different smaller and larger projects in a region to even have the human relationships that you can find out. Oh yeah, here's a situation where if we fund this guy for the next 6 months for at $500 a month to do a bit of community building and support for a community group, then the funding will arrive in 6 months. But if we wait for the funding, then the whole energy of the process will die and he has to restart. So this kind of, I mean, this is a particular case where I've used the flow fund that I have at the moment here on Mallorca to not let a process die, or Darren Doherty, the regenerative agriculture expert, coming to Mallorca but needing a certain amount of committed participants on his regenerative open consult of one of the farms here. And and then just basically having that flow fund to say, okay, well, I'll just create 7 bursaries. That way, you'll definitely have those people paying,
Right.
and
Right.
therefore he could say yes. And it's these are things that you could in no grant application could you go into that kind of detail, but it's actually a really catalytic use of money. Like those 3,500 euros for 7 bursaries have created all sorts of real change on the ground, human connections, further ongoing work, and still do all sorts of multiplying because those people were the local farmers and were the local farm educators that
Right.
otherwise wouldn't have been there. So yeah, I think that this pitching to philanthropic wealth, that by creating the enabling constraint of saying we focus on certain bioregions and then really supporting the process funding in that region, and killing all that reporting industry, which is just wasting human energy and time and money, uh,
Yes.
and flipping it towards a trust-based system because like
Well, that is a theory of change
yeah,
too.
it is it's to some
It
extent,
is a theory
yeah,
of change
yeah.
that speaks to moving funds in a direction of deep relationality and trust. Um, and because of that, to some degree, creating a diverse landscape of incentive.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the things that's part of my theory of change is how do you create a context where incentive structures evolve somewhat naturally relative to the ecology of relationships and needs and trust. And
mm,
that's what you just described.
mm,
And it's like um the only way that I mean there's other experiments in shifting incentive landscapes, but what you've just spoken to is the core of it.
mm,
It's that you can only really deeply shift incentive landscapes by being locally responsive to real needs and
mm,
nourishing the fabric of trust and possibility.
mm.
And that has to be hyper contextual.
Yeah, and it's slow work.
Mhm.
Like it takes time because trust builds over time and over like the rhythmicity is so important in all of this. Like bringing people together with a certain rhythm so they can form what again it's where we were earlier. Like this disconnectedness that we don't even know we have to place and to community.
Mhm.
Anybody who's ever been in a process where they meet with the same people once a month for a year will know that those people are very, very, very different people to you after that year than they were before that. Because it's about kind of seeing people go through changes and over time that that builds human relationship and that's what we need to somehow build many more structures that enable that again. Um, like anyway, I think we should probably
I think so.
wrap it up. Otherwise, nobody's going to listen to this because it's going to be so long. I mean, these are the long forms anyway. Only the really hardy people end up listening to the entire thing. But it's surprising to see how many people actually are listening every now and then when I get the statistics. So
Mhm.
thank you so much for this conversation. And it'll probably take me until November, sometime late November, until I finally get this up.
Perfect. The book comes out November 28th. So,
Ah, perfect. Good.
sometime in that window is just right.
And then we'll do another recording for the Coming Home to Life podcast with then the RNS Foundation, which is exciting.
Mhm.
And I will stop the recording now, but I want to say goodbye after. Where's the recording?